Former allies, future enemies? As the YPG pushes the regime out of Qamishli, we ask if Assad's starting to lose support. Also on today's program, finding the cure to one of the world's deadliest diseases. The WHO pilots the largest trial yet of a new vaccine against malaria. And in Picture This, Solar Impulse returns to the skies with a 62-hour voyage across the Pacific Ocean. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Last month's cessation of hostilities brought about the biggest lull in fighting in Syria's 5-year conflict. But while the bombs stopped falling in many areas, in others, the battles continue. Attacks on Daesh and al-Nusra Front are excluded from the agreement, and the YPG has used the opportunity to seize more territory. The terror group has already declared parts of northern Syria a federal zone. And last week, it tried to push Assad's forces out of Qamishli, the city it sees as its stronghold. Although a ceasefire is now into place, the latest fighting is being seen as the biggest challenge to the regime's alliance with the YPG. Our newsmaker today is Syria, as we ask if Bashar al-Assad is starting to lose his allies.
5 years after the start of the Syrian conflict, the country has become a complex war zone. A web of internal players backed by different regional and global powers. In Syria, the enemy of your enemy is not always your friend, and alliances keep changing. Until last week, regime forces and the YPG were united in their fight against Daesh and had largely avoided confrontation. But both sides have now turned on each other in the northern city of Qamishli. YPG forces fought with Assad units in the city center for 4 days and captured a prison. Dozens were killed on both sides, which once shared control of this area. A ceasefire is now in place, shops are closed, and people have been told to stay indoors. But no one is sure whether it will last. And there's doubt over Assad's relationship with the YPG, a group he long considered an ally, but perhaps no more. Assad still gets support from the outside. Iran and Hezbollah are key Shia partners and were the first to offer military support. Russia also stepped in last September, launching airstrikes to help the regime. Moscow recently ended its air campaign, which some saw as a reduction in support. But Russian forces remain engaged on the ground. It was with Russian help that Assad troops retook Palmyra from Daesh last month. But despite having powerful friends, Assad could be losing his upper hand as another round of peace talks fail over disagreement on his future in Syria. Sandra Gottman, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Syrian-American activist Kenan Rahmani. And joining us in studio is Helin Sara Ertem, U.S. foreign policy expert at Istanbul Medeniyet University. Thanks both of you for joining us. Kenan Rahmani, let me start with you. Is Bashar al-Assad losing his allies?
No, I don't think so at all. I mean, I think if you look at what's happening on the ground right now, the opposition potentially is losing the support of its international allies, while Russia and Iran double down. There's talk recently of Iran building up its forces south of Aleppo with the Assad regime in an attempt potentially to take Aleppo city, which would be a very significant milestone if it actually were to happen. And then on the other hand, you have Russian air forces almost entirely back in the country, striking with the same intensity and regularity that we were seeing a couple months ago before the partial withdrawal. So I don't think at all that Bashar al-Assad is losing his allies.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, interesting that you mentioned that. You mentioned Iran and Russia. I wanted to initially talk about the YPG, but we'll talk about them in a moment. Let me ask you, Helin, do you believe that the ceasefire has been good then for Assad and, say, the Russians and the Iranians, that they've managed to sort of build up their strength under the cover of the ceasefire?
Somehow I think we can agree with this idea that the ceasefire atmosphere is actually strengthening their position in the region. However, generally speaking, looking at Syria, I think we should admit that everything is so complex and so confusing at the moment. So who is together whom is one of the basic questions that we've been asking from the very beginning. So the alliances, friendships, enmities, etc. These are all changing quite rapidly in the region. So we are not sure about anything in a near future.
Is the ceasefire a sham, Helen?
No, I don't think so. If it's helping to rescue the lives of at least a couple of people, then this is something useful in my point of view. So I don't think,
Kenan, the fighting, is it sporadic or fatal to the ceasefire? Should the whole ceasefire be called off? Because we're seeing fighting happening on the ground right now.
Well, I mean, with regards to the fact that the ceasefire, I believe, is a sham. I mean, you cannot expect after 5 years of this conflict and after the Assad regime and its backers have circumvented and bypassed almost every single resolution that the United Nations has agreed to and has intentionally forced the ceasefire to fall apart in the past couple of weeks, as they have with previous ceasefires, we cannot expect the regime to actually abide by these ceasefires. There has to be more on the part of the international community to actually force the regime and its allies to act in good faith when it comes to these agreements, and there has to be a political transition tied to any kind of reduction of violence. That's not to say that there isn't a reduction in violence over the past couple months. We certainly welcome the fact that there were only a few hundred people killed in the month of March, which was a significant reduction. However, what we saw was that the Assad regime violated the ceasefire 896 times in the month of March alone. So I believe it's time for the international community to step up its enforcement of these political agreements.
Yeah, Kenan, at the beginning of the discussion, I asked you if Bashar al-Assad is losing his allies. You said no, and you cited Moscow, and you cited Iran. What about the PYD or the YPG? So just on the border with Turkey, do you see their conflict with Assad regime forces as just some factions going off script in isolated events, or is there a fault line here? Is there some sort of crack in that alliance at least?
I mean, what we can say, I think, with regards to the YPG is, first of all, this isn't the first time that there have been clashes between the YPG and the Assad regime. There have been clashes before in 2012 and 2013. But I think what the international community needs to recognize is the YPG is not an ally of the Assad regime. The YPG has its own agenda. They want to have a free, autonomous region for the Kurdish people. They have continued to be opportunistic, seeking support from both America and Moscow at the same time in the pursuit of this objective. And I don't think that the Assad regime and the YPG interests can intersect forever. At some point, Assad will try to take back these areas from the YPG, and the YPG will not allow that. So ultimately, they were going to clash one way or the other. But I think with respect to the Assad regime and the recent attacks on YPG-held towns, including Qamishli and Sheikh Maqsood, I think the Assad regime also only attacks when it needs to. We saw the same thing with ISIS. The regime and ISIS are obviously at odds with one another. No one can say that they're allies in a very believable way. However, the Assad regime doesn't really attack ISIS as much as it attacks the moderate opposition, as much as it attacks areas which are not in the control of ISIS. So I think what we're seeing now with respect to the YPG is that the Assad regime is having to make a few attacks on YPG areas for tactical reasons, but I don't think it changes the overall dynamics of the conflict.
Kenan, do you believe that the United States, in the name of enemy of my enemy is my friend, is naive in their support for the YPG?
Well, I think they are naive if they believe that the YPG can actually be their sole partner on the ground when it comes to fighting against ISIL. The YPG can be very effective in fighting ISIL in certain regions. But the YPG cannot take Raqqa, it cannot take Deir ez-Zor. These are areas which were held, which have been always inhabited by Arabs. And in order to be able to fight against ISIL in these areas, you need to have a coalition which includes mostly Arabs, Sunnis, who are willing to fight against ISIL. So if the idea of the Obama administration is to depend entirely on the YPG for that fight, I don't think that's going to work. And there also are problems. I mean, the YPG has committed certain crimes against Arabs that are living in their areas. They've committed crimes against Armenians in certain areas in Iraq as well. So we need to be very careful with who we're allying with respect to the YPG.
Helen, is Bashar al-Assad beginning to fear or realize, hey, these guys are more interested in formalizing their control over their turf than they are in helping me fight Daesh? Do you think this has dawned on him just now?
You mean the West?
The YPG.
The YPG. I think, I mean, coming to your first question to him, we can say that there have been cracks between YPG and Assad regime since the very beginning. So, of course, they won't be permanently two good allies to each other. These alliances are all temporary. Excuse me, temporary alliances, and we cannot rely on them. Looking from the eyes of the West, what we can say is that, you know, the West is looking at Syria and seeing that only YPG or PYD is the one pure group that they can rely on. They know what is PYD is, what PYD is. And they are confused about the rest of the organizations, which are under the title of moderate groups. And I think this confusion makes them really worried about their future plans in Syria. That's why they shifted their focal point and they, in my point of view, gave up the idea of trying to topple Assad in Syria.
Helen, let's try and get into the heads of the Iranians and the Russians for a second. Would they be seeing anything on the ground right now, given the current status of the war, to make them back off and stop supporting Assad? The Iranians are deeply invested. The Russians maybe in a more pragmatic sense. Would they be seeing any reason to back off?
Not at all. I don't think that they see any reason to back off at the moment. I mean, in a way, I think both West, Russia, and Iran are actually agreeing on the idea of, you know, getting rid of ISIS from the region. So this is the main focal point of them. And we've been seeing that Assad has become the secondary priority for them to deal with. ISIS is the first priority of these three forces, three great powers, let's say, in the region. And Turkey somehow is having a kind of difficulty because Turkey is taking PYD and ISIS to the other side, to the opposite side, and somehow trying to deal with them both, which is a very difficult mission at the moment. Because in the coming future, I think what we will see at the Turkish border with Syria, on the Syrian side, I mean, is either Assad forces or PYD. We won't see ISIS in the future in the border region. Right. So Turkey is making something quite difficult because it's trying to fight against both, you know.
Right. Okay, let me get some final thoughts from Kenan. You want to respond to that, Kenan?
I would just say, I don't think we can really say that Iran and Russia believe fighting against ISIS is their #1 priority. Everything that we have seen in terms of where Iran is fighting against, where Iran is fighting on the ground in Syria, suggests they're not really fighting against ISIS as much as they're fighting against other opposition forces that are battling the Assad regime. And the same goes with Russia. I mean, Russia in the past few months has launched hundreds of airstrikes in Syria. Only roughly 10% of them targeted ISIL. So I don't think we can say that the primary objective of Russia and Iran is to fight against ISIL. With respect to the West, I think perhaps they've now shifted from fighting against Assad, but to fighting against ISIL. But I do believe also there's recognition that you cannot get rid of ISIS without also transitioning Assad out of power.
Okay, Helen, Kenan saying that the Iranians and the Russians fight anyone who fights Assad. They're not particularly interested in ISIS only.
This depends on where you look, where you look at the issue from. So from my point of view, as an expert on the region, as an international relations professor, let's say, these three forces are somehow agreeing on one certain agenda. And my interest here is why Turkey is apart from this agenda, why Turkey is outside of this agenda at the moment. For me, I mean, to try to weigh a kind of way out from this chaotic atmosphere in Syria is something very significant for Turkey at the moment. So in my point of view, Turkey should reconsider its policies in the region. I know it is difficult, and I know it's also difficult to fight against two forces at the same time. Even this is not a physical fight, you are seeing Kilis at the moment, which is under fire of ISIS for days, for weeks. And people are dying every day in Kilis. And I think we have to find an urgent solution about the ISIS problem together with the West. This might include Iran and Russia as well.
But how does Turkey take the foot off the gas, say, in fighting the PYD, when the PYD is deeply connected to suicide bombings in Ankara in March and killing civilians? Do they just say, OK, we're not going to focus on the PYD for now and get on board with everybody else? You understand the predicament, don't you?
Yeah, I do understand, but I think we have to make a kind of ranking. Number one, threat. Number two, threat somehow. So the number one threat at the moment is ISIS, which is very, very critical in the region. And I think Turkey should show that it is determined enough to fight against ISIS, because people in the region, in southeastern Turkey, are waiting for their government, for their state to do something.
OK. A case of priorities. Helen and Kenan, I'd love to go on, but unfortunately time is our enemy. I have to wrap.
Can I just like to
Finally,
say one more thing,
in under
which
20
is that
seconds,
Turkey
please, Kenan.
absolutely has... Turkey has shifted its priorities to ISIS. That's very obvious. They've been striking ISIS targets in northwest Aleppo, and they've been trying to shift the border back and give it control back to the moderate opposition. The PKK, of course, is unacceptable for Turkey, so of course they will continue to fight. But their number one priority, I believe, is ISIS. And I just came back from Syria a month ago, and that's what I saw on the ground. OK, I'll let that be the button on the discussion. Kenan and Helen, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us.
Thank you.
Still to come on the Newsmakers, we look at the latest efforts to eradicate one of the world's deadliest diseases. And in Picture This, a 4,000-kilometer flight powered by the sun. Solar Impulse completes its journey across the Pacific after a 10-month delay. Monday is World Malaria Day, and this year there's been an encouraging step towards eradicating the disease. After 30 years of development, a vaccine has been endorsed by the World Health Organization and will be given to tens of thousands of children in Africa, the largest trial to date. The disease still kills more than 400,000 people a year, many of them infants. The Newsmakers' Duncan Crawford reports.
It kills almost 500,000 people a year. Half the world's population is at risk of contracting it, and mosquitoes spread it. But the fight against malaria has picked up speed in the past decade.
And we're jointly committing £3 billion to eliminate malaria from the world.
Now there's more awareness, more treatments, and more hope, as 200,000 children should receive the first ever vaccine this year. Funding has increased tenfold, all with the aim of meeting one goal.
The scientific community has agreed that by 2040 we can get rid of this disease.
Malaria is caused by parasites that are transmitted to people through the bites of infected mosquitoes. 95 countries are affected by it, but there is some good news. Between 2000 and 2015, the number of malaria cases fell by 37%, and the number of people who died fell by 60%. It means that more than 6 million malaria deaths have been avoided. But although the rate of cases has fallen overall, some areas are still struggling. Sub-Saharan Africa is disproportionately affected, In 2015, it accounted for 88% of all malaria cases and 90% of deaths from the disease. And despite efforts to stop it from spreading, people are still dying there twice as often as anywhere else in the world. Duncan Crawford, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Seattle to discuss the fight against malaria is Martin Edlund, CEO of Malaria No More, an international development organization campaigning to eradicate malaria within a generation. Thanks for joining us, Martin. So a vaccine's around the corner, and as we heard in Duncan's piece there, between 2000 and 2015, according to the World Health Organization, the rate of infections down 37%, deaths down by 60% in countries where it's endemic. All of this cause for you to celebrate?
Certainly cause for celebration, and I would say cautious optimism. You know, what we're talking about here is one of the oldest, deadliest diseases in the history of mankind. By some estimations, it's killed more people than any other disease, any other cause in history. So the fact that we're talking about a 60% decline in malaria deaths, the fact that we're talking with a straight face about ending this disease is cause for real celebration, yes.
How soon until we have that vaccine and it's going to be given to every kid in every school in the world?
So the reality of the malaria fight is there's no one silver bullet. This isn't like smallpox or polio where a vaccine is going to be the only solution to this fight. We have hugely effective tools like insecticide-treated bed nets, rapid diagnostic tests, effective treatments. The vaccine that you're talking about and that's now going into field trials is a really important step in that progression, and it would be a great addition to the arsenal we have. But we're not relying on a vaccine to advance these plans to end this disease.
Oh, tell me a little bit about the evolutionary arms race at play here, the resistance and how difficult it is for scientists to keep up with malaria.
Yeah, it's a great topic, great point. You know, the reality of malaria is you've got human beings who are affected by it, but then you've got mosquitoes who transmit it and a parasite that's ultimately the cause of the problem. And we're really contending with both of those organisms in this fight. So as we develop medicines, and we have highly effective medicines now, there's always the risk that the parasite is going to grow resistant to those medicines. We're seeing that happen in Southeast Asia now. And then on the other hand, you have mosquitoes, of course, and we're using insecticides, but we're seeing growing and alarming evidence that the mosquitoes are becoming resistant to the kinds of insecticides that we use on nets. And so we need new formulations of insecticides to stay ahead of that arms race. It's really the reason that we're talking not about resting on our laurels and celebrating success and moving on to something else, but we need to keep pushing this fight. We need to ultimately end this disease, or we risk losing that arms race against the parasite and the mosquito.
Are there any particularly vulnerable spots on the globe where we're not winning this war against malaria? Any particular countries that might come to mind?
Yeah, as you said in the intro, we've made huge progress, 6.2 million lives saved. But the reality is a child's still dying every 2 minutes from malaria. And that's the real vulnerability point. You know, it's children under 5 and pregnant women who are most at risk of this disease. As you also said, nearly 90% of those deaths are in sub-Saharan Africa, so that's a clear vulnerability. You know, it's worst where it's most tropical and where you have, you know, sometimes insufficient health systems. And so countries like DRC and Nigeria, both by virtue of their population and climate, are really the epicenters of this fight.
Martin Edlund, really good to get your thoughts and expertise on malaria. Hopefully we can win that fight.
Indeed. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. In today's Picture This, an experimental plane has landed in California after completing a successful 2.5-day flight across the Pacific Ocean without using a single drop of fuel. Let's take a look.
It's a miracle of technology.
Today's newsmaker has been Syria, as we asked whether the regime was losing its allies. The long-standing alliance between the regime and the YPG appears to be feeling the strain. The YPG has already declared an autonomous region in northern Syria, what appears to be its primary objective from this war. Both the opposition and the regime say they will not accept any breaking up of Syria. But Assad's latest concessions to the YPG appear to show that he is, for now, being more pragmatic. You've been watching this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye-bye.